Hello, welcome to the Introduction to Linguistics seminar, 12th time. This will be the last in this season, so today we're going to be looking at the last part of syntax, where we're going to be investigating the kinds of rules that we use in syntax to produce the kinds of analyses, the tree diagrams and bracketed, labelled bracketings that we use to describe the structure of sentences. Let's first off start by looking at the kinds of structures that we've been supposing. Now, from last week's class, you may remember the kinds of things that we can see in this construction here. One thing to note is that the auxiliary verb, particularly the modal auxiliary verb like may and can, shall, should, and everything like that, they form a phrase with the following verb phrase, but that phrase isn't a verb phrase. So we've called it here an inflection phrase because that was the term during the 1970s that was invented for this class of elements. The modal auxiliaries didn't seem to behave like verbs in the normal sense. They seem to be different, and they form a phrase which is different from the verb phrase. So they called them inflections, and they had an inflectional phrase, or IP for short. The other thing to note is the nominal phrase that we've been labelling NP up until now. The idea here is that, in fact, that the noun phrase, the phrase with the noun in it, is actually a part of that whole phrase, and the actual phrase itself is what we call a determiner phrase. Okay, so the determiner is the element inside that phrase, which gives the phrase its name, and that's a DP. Okay, so this is the kind of structure that we've been looking at so far. The sentence itself splits into two parts, the subject and the predicate. The subject in this one is a DP, the cook, and the predicate is the inflectional phrase, may bake a pie. That contains a verb phrase, bake a pie, which has an object in it, the DP inside the VP. That's the a pie thing. Now, what kind of rules are we going to need to produce such a structure? Well, one way to look at this, and the way that's been done since the end of the 1950s, is to look at that structure piece by piece and have rules that tell you how to build the structure from its elemental parts. And the basic part of the structure seems to be an element which then splits into a number of other elements. So, for example, take this structure and just concentrate there at the top part of it there. What we've got is a structure which says the sentence S breaks into two parts, a DP, which is the subject, and an IP, which is the predicate. Now, the kind of rule then we want is something that tells you that sentences can be broken up into two parts. And this is what this kind of rule is. This is known as a rewrite rule. The arrow in the rule there is often pronounced as rewrites as. So we say S rewrites as a DP followed by an IP. Okay, basically it's an instruction of how to draw that bit of the structure that we see over there on the left-hand side. The S is at the top, and that's what comes in front of the arrow. Underneath it and connected to it by branches in the tree are the DP and the IP, and that's what comes to the right of the arrow. So the rule works like this. Anything to the left of the arrow is at the top of the structure. Anything to the right of the arrow is underneath that thing and connected to it by branches. Let's have a look at the next part of the structure then. Let's look at the IP. There again, we see that breaks into two parts, an I, an inflectional element, followed by a verb phrase. So obviously the kind of rule that we need to produce that is going to look like this. The IP is to the left of the left of the arrow, I followed by VP is to the right. Same is going to be true with the DP. Okay, so we've got a DP splitting into two parts, a determiner followed by an NP. Of course, that gives us this rule. Going further down inside the IP, we get to the VP, and the rule that tells us that a VP can break up into a verb followed by an object, or another DP, is obviously going to be something like this. Underneath that, we've got the DP, but of course we don't need a new rule for that because we've already got one. The DP in the subject position and the DP in the object position are the same structured kind of thing. They both involve a determiner followed by a noun phrase. So the same rule can be recycled there to do that. Finally, we've got the NP, and obviously the two NPs here. Again, we only need one rule for them because in each case we've got an NP made up of just the noun, so that can be a rule that tells us the noun phrase contains a noun, nothing else. Obviously, this doesn't cover all of the possibilities. There are other kinds of phrases, prepositional phrases, adjectival phrases, adverbial phrases, etc., etc. Different kinds of phrases are going to need different kinds of rules. But this set of rules, as you can see, can produce this particular sentence, but also a whole bunch of other sentences based on this pattern. And again, we can see that by recycling the same rules, we can produce more or less complicated structures. Obviously, we're going to need more rules than what we've got here, but when we've got a collection of rules then like this, we could say that that is the basic grammar of the language. That will produce all possible grammatical structures for the language, and hopefully none of the ungrammatical structures. A set of these rules then we call a phrase structure grammar. Okay, so that would be a set of these rules would constitute the knowledge, as it were, of how we put words together to form these kinds of structures. Now, how can we extend this? Well, let's look at some other possibilities. For example, consider this one, the cook baked a pie. Now here we don't have the modal auxiliary, we just have a verb, and therefore presumably we don't have an inflectional phrase because there's no inflection element there, we've just got the verb. So presumably we've got another possibility that a sentence can break up into the subject DP followed by a VP predicate, not an IP predicate. So one thing we could do is just add another rule to that effect, saying now we've got two rules for the sentence. It either breaks up into a DP followed by a VP or a DP followed by an IP. Another thing we could possibly think about there would be to collapse those two rules into one slightly more complicated rule that gives rise to both options. So for example, might do that like this. The curly brackets inside this rule indicate a choice. Okay, so what we say is that the sentence breaks up into a DP followed by either an IP or a VP. Okay, so that's how we might think about sort of extending these rules. We can look for other possible structures, invent different rules, and maybe collapse more than one rule into a single rule which gives you all of the possibilities. However, in this particular instance, we may not want to follow this line of thought because it misses out on a fairly important observation. And you can see that if we compare these two sentences that we've been looking at, the cook may bake a pie and the cook baked a pie. Now we've said that in the second one, obviously there's something missing that was there in the first one, that is the modal auxiliary. The second one doesn't have a modal auxiliary, so it looks as though the second one is simpler, or certainly not as big, as it were. However, that fails to notice that there is something in the second one that isn't present in the first one, and that is the tense morpheme on the verb. We've got there the form of the verb baked. Okay, and note you haven't got that when you've got the modal auxiliary, the cook may bake a pie. In fact, the modal auxiliary and the tense morpheme can't appear together in the same sentence. You can't say the cook may baked a pie. Okay, and that would seem to suggest that modal auxiliary verbs and tense morphemes are in complementary distribution. Now, that's an odd observation because complementary distribution, we've seen in the past, seems to indicate that two things are the same kind of thing. In syntax, what complementary distribution could be taken to mean is that two things are trying to occupy the same position. So, given that only one element can occupy that position, you're either going to get one or the other, but you're never going to be able to get both. They're in complementary distribution. And therefore, this observation would seem to suggest that the inflection, the inflection modal element and the tense morpheme are trying to occupy the same position. And of course, that's a very strange thing to say. Until we notice that what we're talking about here is an inflectional morpheme. Tense, we've said, is one of the inflectional morphemes, and inflectional morphemes, we argued when we were looking at morphology, are things that happen in the syntax. That kind of morphological process is put together by a syntactic process, not a morphological one applying before syntax gets a chance to work, say in the lexicon. Now, if that's the way to look at it, then what we want to say is that the tense morpheme actually is separated from the verb in the syntax, and that it's a syntactic process that gets them together. Now, that would seem to argue then that when you've got a tense morpheme, you actually do have an inflectional element. Okay, and so the structure of the sentence looks like this. Okay, there is an inflectional element there. That's what's in complementary distribution with the modal, because something is filling that position in the tense sentence, and the modal can't sit there. Note also that this simplifies the grammar somewhat too, because now we don't need that complicated S rule. We just say sentences are made up of determiner phrases followed by inflectional phrases, and that's all we need to say. Of course, the question is, well, what is it that occupies that inflection position? And as we've said, we've got here an extra morpheme that wasn't present in the one with the modal auxiliary. We've got the past tense morpheme. So we could assume that what's actually happening here is that the past tense morpheme occupies that position, the inflection position, and that's why it's in complementary distribution with the modal. You can't have a modal and a tense at the same time because they are both inflections. And in fact, you can see now the sense in why the term inflection was used for this category, including the modals. Okay, obviously it was named after the actual tense morphemes that sat in this position. These are the inflectional morphemes, and apparently modal auxiliaries are of the same category. They both sit in the same positions, and it's category that determines the position that things occupy in a sentence. Now, there's a difference, obviously, between modal auxiliaries and tense morphemes. They're both inflections of the same category, but they have different natures from a morphological point of view. The modal auxiliaries are free morphemes, and therefore they can just sit there all by themselves. Tense morphemes are bound morphemes. They need to be stuck onto something. Okay, they're verbal bound morphemes, so they need to be stuck onto a verb. So we need some syntactic process that is going to get the verb and the inflection together. And the idea is a fairly simple one. What we suggest is that syntax itself isn't a static thing. That is, we don't just define structures and say that's how it is. But once we've got those structures, we can do things to those structures to change it slightly to accommodate the elements that occupy the positions in the structure. And specifically what we're going to suggest is that there is a movement process that takes hold of that verb and shifts it and puts it into the inflection position specifically to bind that morpheme. Okay, so syntax allows some sort of dynamic process which will move things around inside a structure once the phrase structure grammar has built that structure. Let's have a look at some other cases of movement just to show that this actually is quite a common occurrence in syntax. It's by no means a strange thing that happens to verbs and inflections. Consider these two sentences. The thief may pick the lock and the lock may be picked. They seem to be perfectly good sentences, both of them having different structures. In the first case, we've got the subject, the thief, and may pick the lock, an inflectional phrase involving a verb phrase with a verb pick. Pick is a transitive verb. It takes an object, and therefore we've got this DP inside the VP, the lock. Okay. Second sentence, we've got the subject, the lock, again an inflectional phrase with a verb phrase in it. This time we've got what looks to be an intransitive verb without an object. Okay, but clearly these two sentences are related to each other. They mean pretty much the same thing, and they're using pretty much the same words. We've got the verb to pick in both cases. We've got the lock in both cases. There are differences between them, but they're clearly related to each other. In fact, traditional grammar has already observed this relationship in as much as we call these two sentences different forms of the same sort of sentence. We say that the first one is the active form of the sentence, whilst the second is the passive form of the sentence. So what is it about active and passive sentences that make them related? Obviously not every sentence is related like this. What is it that relates active and passive sentences? Well, if we have a look at the sentences, we can see, well, one thing they've got in common is that they use pretty much the same sorts of words. We've got, as I said before, the verb to pick there, we've got the lock in both cases. There are some things in one that are not in the other, but they're made from the same kinds of words. So, presumably, that's the reason that the two sentences are similar, related to each other, having similar meanings. But that can't be the whole story, because compare these two sentences. These two sentences are made up of exactly the same words, and yet, clearly, they don't relate to each other in the same way that the active and the passive sentence relates to each other. John loves Mary and Mary loved John actually mean completely different things. So they're not related to each other, even though we've got the same words and just rearrange those words. That's not exactly what's going on in the passive. Clearly, we've not just got the same words and rearranged them, because otherwise we would end up with something that means something different. So there's a question here about, well, why does the passive mean something similar to the active when it's got a different arrangement of more or less the same kinds of words? Another observation about the passive and the active comparison concerns the actual verb itself. As we've said, in something like the thief picked the lock, the active version of the sentence, we're using the verb pick, and pick is a transitive verb. That means it's the kind of verb that has an object, the lock in this particular case. Whereas if we look at that sentence and we miss out the object, clearly that's ungrammatical. You can't miss out an object of a transitive verb. A transitive verb is a verb that requires there to be an object following it. So if you miss the object out, the whole thing is ungrammatical. You can't say the thief picked. But look at the passive. The passive is using the verb pick, but no, there's no object there. So it looks as though we're using a transitive verb in an intransitive context. And in fact, it turns out that even though this is a transitive verb, in the passive form of the sentence, you simply can't give it an object. It would be ungrammatical to include an object with this verb. You can't say the door was picked the lock. Okay. So what's actually going on there then? Because with a passive sentence, you take a transitive verb, and they're always transitive. You can only passivize transitive verbs. That is a verb with an object, and in the passive, the verb seems to lose its object. Okay? So there is a question here. Why can't a passive verb, which is obviously transitive then, why can't it have an object? Well, I think the answer to this question, and in fact the answer to the other question too, about what's the relationship between an active and a passive sentence, comes from the observation that, well, it's not true that passive verbs don't have objects. Clearly, if you take the passive sentence, the lock was picked, we're talking here about the lock being the thing which was picked. So basically the lock is interpreted as the object of the verb. In fact, what's actually missing in the passive is not the object of the verb, but what's missing is the subject. We don't mention the person that actually did the picking of the lock. But obviously, the object is not in the object position, not in the normal object position that we tend to see objects in, that is, inside the VP. Instead, the thing that we interpret as the object is sitting in the subject position at the beginning of the sentence. Now, one way to solve all these problems then would be to simply assume that the object is, in fact, the object of the verb. The thing that is interpreted as the object is in the object position of this sentence. And so what we get is something like this. Okay, what's missing here is obviously the subject. Okay, as we said in the passive, the subject is not mentioned, but the object is, and that's sitting in the object position. Of course, this isn't how we pronounce this sentence. What we do when we pronounce the sentence is to move the object. Again, as a kind of a movement process. It takes the object out of the object position and, for whatever reason, moves it into the subject position, and we end up with the passive form, the lock may be picked. The reason, therefore, why passive and active sentences mean similar things is precisely because they have the same structural arrangement, at least before anything moves. So before anything moves, the object is the object of the verb and gets interpreted as the object. Then we move it. Let's briefly look at some other cases of movement, just to show you that it's not a one-off or a two-off kind of process. It happens all the time. Have a look at this sentence. This sentence is a kind of a question, an interrogative sentence. It's a specific kind called a yes-no question, so called because the answer to it is going to be either yes or no. Will Mary write the book? Now note, this has a particular word order, which is different from the declarative, the non-question sort of statement type of sentence. So Mary will write the book. Specifically, what's different here is that in the interrogative, the modal auxiliary is at the front of the sentence, whereas in the declarative, the modal auxiliary is, as we've already said, after the subject of the sentence and inside the predicate part of the sentence, like the second part. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, traditionally we refer to this syntactic process that forms the interrogative as auxiliary inversion, i.e. that the order of the auxiliary and the subject is inverted, it's changed. One simple way of achieving that change of order is to get hold of that modal auxiliary verb and move it into the front of the sentence. So again, another kind of a movement. Another kind of interrogative also involves movements of another kind. This isn't a yes-no question, because obviously you couldn't answer the questions yes or no. This is often referred to as an information question or a WH question. A WH question because it uses these words with WH in them, like who and what and where and why, etc. It uses those kinds of words to make the question. So what will Mary write? Note, here we've got an instance of inversion. So the will is in front of the subject. Mary is the subject, the one doing the writing. And will is been inverted with it and is at the front of the sentence. We've also got this what element. But if you think about it, that what is interpreted as the object of write. Write is a transitive verb and therefore needs an object. And of course, we don't see an object here in the object position. And the reason for that is that the question is about the thing that is written. So that what relates to the object, not an object position, and therefore we can assume that what's happened is that it's moved. That is, we start off with the what as the object of right, we start off with will in the inflection position, and then what happens is they move. The what moves to the very front of the sentence, and the will inverts with the subject to the other side. One last example of a possible type of movement involves verbs that look like this. Seem is a bit of a strange verb in some ways. It seems that John is rich. What we've got here is the verb seem has it following it. It's got a sentence, so John is rich. So we've got a case of an embedded sentence here. But note that the subject of seem is a bit odd because that it there doesn't mean anything. It's not a sort of a referential it pointing to some object or something. This it is just simply sitting there in the subject position. It's what we call a pleonastic subject, a subject without any meaning. Seems to be there because, well, English requires there to be subjects of sentences. Seem, however, as a verb, doesn't have a meaningful subject of its own. Now, having said that, compare that to this sentence. John seems to be rich. Now, again, in many ways, there's a clear relationship between these two sentences, a bit like the active and the passive, although this isn't an active-passive pair. But they both mean the same sort of thing. It seems John is rich and John seems to be rich, more or less mean the same thing. In particular, John is the one who is interpreted as the one being rich. Okay? Now, however, they're not the same in as much as the order of things is different in them. John, in the second case, is actually sitting in the subject position of seems, which is very odd because we've said that verb seem isn't the kind of verb that has a meaningful subject of its own. And even in this sentence, you don't interpret John to be the meaningful subject of seem. John isn't the one who seems. What seems here is, of course, that John is rich. So we've got a sentence there that the order of things doesn't quite match up to its meaning. The meaning is more like this, which is pretty similar to the first sentence. We've got seem without a subject, and then we've got a sentence, John to be rich, is a different kind of sentence to the one that we had in the first case, John is rich, because there we've got a tense element. In the second case, we don't have a tense, but no, we do have something in that inflection position, which is this word to. This is known as an infinitive sentence, a different kind of sentence, but a sentence nonetheless. It's got everything that a sentence requires. It's got a subject, John, it's got an inflection, to, and then it's got a verb phrase, be rich. Okay, so this is more or less exactly the same as the one we see above, and that's why they mean the same sort of thing. But clearly in the second sentence, a movement takes place. In this time, it's the subject of the embedded clause which moves to the subject of the verb seem. And so we end up with John seems to be rich. Again, another kind of movement. So clearly, movements are something that we find a lot in syntax, not just a bit of movement to sort verbs and inflections out, but all sorts of things move from different positions to other positions. And it seems, therefore, that movements is a very basic aspect of grammar, of syntax. Now, just to finish off with then, let's look at what that actually means as far as the way the grammar seems to be organised. We've seen we have the phrase structure rules, which go to produce certain structures. The grammatical structures of the language are produced by the phrase structure rules, which tell us how to build those structures. But then, once we've got those structures, there's something else that can happen. We have these movement processes which take elements from positions in those structures and move them to some other positions, and thereby we get different structures. Now, it's important to understand here that the structures that we've got in this picture here aren't related to different sentences. What we've got here is a structural representation of the same sentence. Okay, the phrase structure rules produce the basic structure of that sentence. Movements come along and shift things around to produce something closer to what we actually see. But these are two different representations of exactly the same sentence. Okay, it's not a system whereby we produce some sentences and then move things around to produce other sentences. That's not how this is supposed to be seen. So, essentially then, for every sentence, there's going to be a way of representing the structure of the sentence before anything moves, and we're going to have a way of representing the same sentence after movements have taken place. In order to separate those two, we call them different things. We call the kind of structure you get before movements, we call those D structures, and the kinds of structures we get after movements, we call those S structures. And every sentence has a D structure and an S structure representation. Okay, that's as much as we need to do, so let's quickly summarize what we've said. We've said that part of our grammatical knowledge involves phrase structure rules. And phrase structure rules are of that form that we see there, have a symbol to the left of the arrow and symbols to the right of the arrow. The thing in the left-hand side denotes the thing at the top of the structure, and the things underneath, or to the right of the arrow, represent the things which are directly connected underneath that thing. So basically this rule says a constituent of type X can be made up of two constituents, one of type Y followed by one of type Z. Okay, that's a more abstract way of putting it. Now, obviously, such a rule gives the structure of a small part, a sub-tree, as it were, of a whole syntactic structure, and obviously we need other rules to tell us what the rest of it looks like. Once we've got a set of rules which will tell us all of the parts of all of the structures of a language, then we have a phrase structure grammar. However, that's not the only thing we need in order to describe all sorts of other linguistic syntactic phenomena, such as the relationship between passive and active sentences, the relationship between interrogatives and declaratives, etc., etc. We need to have something else other than just the phrase structure rules. Essentially, we need rules that tell us how to move things around. So syntax is a dynamic process rather than a static thing where we just define static structures where nothing happens within them. The kinds of movements that we've looked at: verbs can move to support bound inflections. Objects can move to subject position in passive sentences. Auxiliary verbs can invert with subjects in these yes-no type questions, and WH phrases can move to the beginning of the clause in other kinds of interrogative sentences. So those are the kinds of movements we've looked at. Now, the phrase structure grammar part of this grammar produces the D structures, the structures which represent the organization of a sentence before anything moves. And at D structure, everything is where you would expect it to be. Objects are in object positions, verbs are in verbs positions, inflections are in inflection positions, etc., etc. But then we get movements added to that, and they take the D structure and change it into an S structure simply by moving things around. Verbs can move to support inflections, and objects can move to subject positions in passives, etc., etc. And only once you've got that whole picture then can we really describe what's actually going on in a syntactic grammar. Okay, that's the end of it, and I'll see you in class. Bye-bye.